if we're not thinking in the long term, anything that we can do to prevent environmental problems is much cheaper, not just better for us, but cheaper than trying to deal with it once it actually happens. So it is the short-sightedness that it's a huge problem.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Kyla Tienhaara, Assistant Professor in the School of Environmental Studies, as well as the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University. And the fact that she's cross-appointed between those two different departments is exactly what she's trying to talk about. The intersection between the environment and the economy, between the philosophy of John Maynard Keynes and the modern environmental movement that is trying to essentially save our habitat. And what she's trying to study is called Green Keynesianism. It's a really interesting conversation with Kyla. We also shift track and talk about a few other things, such as market values and the neoliberal framework that it's quite hard to think outside of, the rise of economics as a profession, the nature of corporations and social enterprises, the Green New Deal, spearheaded by American Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and of course the danger of creating new jobs under the paradigm of infinite growth. All of those things are coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Now, if you like this show, I'd like you to please give it a rating on iTunes or Facebook or whatever podcast app that you use. Also, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. And if you have any suggestions for future guests or episodes or feedback on this episode or any other one, please email me. Now here's the conversation this week. Kyla Tienhaara, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you. There's a lot of things that you study and have written books about that I'm keen to dig into. Specifically the environment, the interaction between the environment and the economy, and also these kind of twin events that occurred about 10 years ago, the Great Recession that happened at the same time as a growing awareness in the modern sense of our environmental responsibility, sustainability, the green shift, which we're still debating about today. But we're also debating, of course, the outcome of the Great Recession and the actions that were taken. But I want to get to all of that in just a moment, because first I've got the big question that is for you. It's deliberately broad for a deliberately broad response. Kyla, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, well, it is great to have that question because what on earth is going on is that we are facing the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced. That the very real possibility that we will not only drive many other species to extinction, but ultimately possibly also our own species. And we're not doing a fantastic job of responding to this crisis at the moment.
Why not? And then what should we be doing differently?
Why not? Well, there's so many reasons. I mean, first of all, I want to make clear that while climate change gets the vast majority of the discussion, not enough discussion, but of the environmental issues, it gets the focus. There are numerous other crises that we are facing at the same time. So biodiversity is the most obvious one. We're losing species at a really dramatic rate. But there are 9 so-called planetary boundaries. So about 10 years ago, a group at the Stockholm Resilience Center came up with this idea of planetary boundaries, and their focus was to try to show that there is what they call a safe operating space for humanity. So if we start to breach these boundaries, then we are moving beyond the point where humans can really live in a comfortable life that the way we've understood things for millennia. We're moving beyond that comfortable space and threatening our own survival. So climate change gets a lot of the focus, but there are also issues about chemical flows and biodiversity and the atmosphere in terms of the ozone layer, one of the only issues that we've managed to do much about. And there's been a suggestion that we're actually moving into a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, where we are such a huge force that we are actually changing the entire nature of the planetary system. So these are incredibly complex problems just at a scientific level. They all interact with each other. But the reason we're not doing enough to deal with them is more because of the way that those issues are wrapped up with the economy, in my opinion.
Right. There's a really interesting thing that that you wrote right in the beginning of your book, just from last year, actually. It's a book that you wrote. I'm trying to look for the title of it here. You probably know it.
Green Keynesianism and the global financial crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
And one thing you say at the beginning of the book is, first of all, you quote Sean Illing, and he asks, is the earth not too big to fail? Yeah. Which is a question we asked about banks back in 2008 and 2009. And our response was, collectively, yes, they are too big to fail. We have to stop them from failing because otherwise our entire system will collapse. And what Sean Illing is saying, and what you therefore say in your book, is that, well, is the earth not the same thing? And if we allow this to fail, then certainly we will fail ourselves, or at least the habitat that we've made the earth into. And another thing that you say around the same time is that the things that are driving, say, the Great Recession, are the same things that are driving environmental collapse and climate change and the degradation of our habitat and environment. And I think that that's something that did not necessarily surprised me, but that I hadn't thought about before, that they're actually the same thing, that are leading to things that anyone on any end of the spectrum would agree with, this is a problem. So maybe talk a bit about that, how these things are linked, and how perhaps, therefore, the solutions might be linked and cross-partisan as well, maybe.
Well, it's great to hear that you learned something from the book, and that I managed to bring together some things that you hadn't thought of before. That's wonderful to hear as an author. I think if you look just at the simplest example of what spurred the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage issue, if at the most simplified level, if you think about debt and about how housing has changed in previous decades, what has happened is people have had access to cheaper credit and have used that in order to get bigger and bigger homes. If you look at the size of homes in places like North America and Australia, they just get bigger and bigger. What does that mean in environmental terms? That means greater heating or cooling costs, depending on which kind of climate you're in. It means more materials. It means more use of land, which encroaches often on spaces that otherwise would be left for wildlife. It means more stuff to fill up the house. You get all these popular things these days about downsizing and, having less stuff. But generally, our economy is completely driven towards promoting consumption. And bigger houses are better, more stuff is better. All of that leads to personal debt and financial issues, and it also leads to environmental problems. So the overconsumption issue, I think, often gets addressed in terms of people should take individual action. So we should recycle more, we should buy greener products, we should focus on efficient products and electric cars rather than gas guzzlers and those type of things. And we should make these kind of individual choices. But if you look at the way that the economy is designed, everything is pushing us towards more consumption. And ultimately, unfortunately, greener consumption, however you want to define that, is not going to make things better enough, right? Because if you look at what happened after the financial crisis, the programs that were supposed to be geared towards both benefiting the environment and the economy by spurring growth and jobs were often geared around things about efficiency. So switch your fridge or your television towards this new, more efficient option. But what people ignored was the fact that the newer products that were more efficient were also bigger. They actually consume more energy. It's been shown that people that buy more fuel-efficient cars end up driving more because they save money on gas.
Right, so, and this reminds me, of Stephen Harper's whole energy policy, which was an environmental policy when he was prime minister, which was essentially focused on emissions intensity as opposed to the total quantity of emissions, right? And I think that's almost it's almost a fake. It's a deke. It's a fake out, and saying, well, no, we're more efficient than we were yesterday. Yeah. But as a result of our growing efficiency, we can actually do even more than we did before. Exactly. And so the line on the graph is still going up and up and up.
Exactly. And I think that's the same thing when we're talking about individual consumption. It's always about let's change the type of consumption rather than the overall level. And the reason for that is because consumption is driving the economy, and every government wants economic growth, and we're completely focused on this measure of GDP as being the measure of whether or not the economy is doing well. And politicians are worried about jobs, and jobs are linked to whether or not the economy is doing well in GDP terms, and it just sort of it's so all interconnected that it's really hard to separate out and say, oh, actually maybe we should be looking for a different type of economy that would better fit with the environment, but also potentially be better for people as well.
So in the same book from 2018, you mentioned two things that are kind of to blame, which is one is overconsumption, the other is infinite growth.
Yeah.
Are they the same thing, or are they distinct? Infinite growth and overconsumption. I mean, I know that they're linked, but I think the reason I ask this is because when we talk about reducing consumption, that's a very important message that many environmentalists are trying to purport, right? We have to reduce the amount that we consume, not just the way in which we consume it, not just the efficiency. But a lot of environmentalists and economists are saying we also need to move to a zero growth economy, or at least a balanced economy that isn't focused on next year we're bigger than last year.
Yeah.
And again, that line continuing to go up. Because whether it's overpopulation, overconsumption, this need to grow, and the fact that our entire economy is based on growth is problematic. But are they actually distinct, or do you think that they're actually just the same thing on the different side of the coin?
I go back and forth on this because the growth issue is so difficult, and it scares people off. And I want to be clear on consumption. I don't mean just individual consumption. I really think that if you look at Canada, where the emissions are increasing is the oil and gas sector. It's not as much in the individual level. So there are things that need to change in terms of the amount that individuals consume, and we need overall consumption in the developed world to decrease quite substantially in order for developing countries to be able to increase their well-being. But with the growth versus consumption, I think it's quite tricky because some people argue, well, you can have growth in things that have no environmental impact or very limited environmental impact. So growth in the healthcare sector, growth in the caring sector more generally, if we have more childcare available, if we have greater growth in the arts sector and more people going out to see plays and things like that. There are some environmental impacts involved with people traveling to go to an art exhibition or something like that, but are pretty minimal compared to the type of environmental impacts you have in the more consumption of goods. So there are services that you can consume, which you could say growth in those areas could help you sort of decouple environmental impacts from growth. Growth in the renewable energy sector, again, there are environmental impacts associated with digging stuff out of the ground in order to make solar panels, in order to make wind turbines, etc. So you don't want to have, I don't think you want to have infinite growth in any of these areas. We need to get to a place where we accept that we have enough. Mm-hmm. And I do think that, there is lots of research to suggest that actually people don't get any happier as they get more income. And so the sort of cycle that we're on at this point, where everybody is overworked and spending a lot of time commuting and not having as much time as they would like with their kids, etc., in order to sort of feed this machine of constant growth, I don't think it's sustainable in human terms, as well as not being sustainable in environmental terms. But I think where you attack the issue is kind of important. I think if we just say we should abandon growth, and without addressing other ways that we can actually achieve full employment and so forth, then we're just going to. You don't want to have. There's a great author and scholar, Peter Victor, who's talked about no growth economy for Canada. It's like, I think the subtitle of his book was Decline by Design, Not Disaster. So basically, there are a lot of people that suggest that we're heading for a decline in growth in any case, and that we should design our way down rather than than just having what we had in 2008, 2009, where you just get, really negative social consequences coming from an economic recession. So I think the things that really interest me about that come out of sort of the ecological economics literature and so forth is ways that you can have more job sharing and shorter working week. I find is one that's really attractive. Who doesn't want to work less? And if that sort of leads to a less consumptive lifestyle where people are actually happier, but also having less of an impact on the environment, then it seems like a win-win.
Right. And it seems a lot of what you're saying ties into what was seeming to be popular just a few years ago. The Liberal Party in Canada, the Democrats in the United States, and European center-left parties who believe that environmental sustainability is an important facet of government and of making things happen, but also to do it in a way that promotes growth and continues the narrative of not only growth, but also consumption. So in other words, we don't have to change our habits and we don't have to change the way we do business. We just need to invest over here.
Yeah.
And if we invest in green energy and green jobs, then we're going to have an energy revolution that will provide the same economic benefits, but with more innovation, more efficiency, and maybe even more growth. And if we do it now, we'll get ahead of the curve. And that philosophy has been, it's a very centrist way of dealing with the problem, because on the one side, obviously the right handles it in a very typical way, which is to say, climate change is a hoax, or there's nothing we can do about it anyways, so why are you bothering to make our businesses less efficient? And then on the other side, of course, which says that environmental sustainability may be an important goal, but we can't achieve it without overthrowing the entire system. And like you just said, if we are always promoting overconsumption and infinite growth, then how do we balance all of that together, right? The other argument, too, comes from some economists who say that in moving towards an almost exclusive service economy, so like you said, enhancing the culture sector of the economy, people going to see plays, writing, creating things, and creating a more sharing economy in that way actually isn't economic growth, that there's something false about that. I don't know if I agree with that. Maybe it's a classical 19th century view of economics, that you have to be producing things and widgets and chairs and cars. But what do you make of that? Do you think that's a fair argument? And do you think we're just kind of spiraling down into an economy that actually doesn't produce anything anymore and just and creates value out of things that are kind of hollow?
Well, ultimately you do need some basic things in order to survive. You need food, clothes, and some basic stuff. So you can't have a 100% service economy. If you're going to be, and then we can talk about trade and the implications of the environment of that. But I think that for me, the focus shouldn't be on economic growth. It should be on creating jobs, because that's ultimately what the point of economic growth should be. And that was the philosophy of Keynes. It wasn't economic growth for the sake of it. It was in order to fulfill a purpose. And he actually, he wrote this wonderful essay. Basically, it was written towards like his hypothetical future grandchildren. And he believed that they would live in a world where everyone would have a super short working week, and it would be sort of this point that had been reached where the basic needs had been met and people would have much more time for leisure. And so if you're talking about plays or any kind of and the arts and all of those sorts of things that I was mentioning, those are providing jobs. They're providing enjoyment for the people that are participating in them, and they create community. They contribute to society. So I just because they're not as important in GDP terms. There have been plenty of people that have, said GDP is not an appropriate metric for determining economic growth. There was a whole commission in France that came out and said that's not an appropriate metric. It doesn't take into account all of the labor that is done for free, especially by women in terms of childcare and so forth. It counts pollution as a good because it costs a whole lot to clean it up, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're talking about GDP growth as a measure, then I think we're looking at the wrong thing. I think that the focus should really be on jobs. That's what matters to people in the end. Well,
and I want to get to Keynes in a second, but before we do, I just want to talk about this idea of value, right? I mean, GDP is based on what we have valued the total amount of production of an economy as. And so the things that we value today are different than the things we valued 50 years ago. In fact, someone 50, 100, 200 years ago would look at something today that is worth $100 billion or $1 trillion in the case of Apple or Amazon. And they would say, that's not worth anything. Yeah. It's invisible. It's illusory. You're not producing anything. You're not making anything. But of course, we would look at what's valuable in 1807, like a train line, as being almost useless today, or a canal. And so the changing nature of values obviously is a great part of our history. But is the reason I'm bringing this up is that when we talk about making our economy environmentally sustainable and dealing with this crisis that you say is the greatest thing that we've ever faced, do we have to, in order to do that, change our values, change our paradigm, and therefore maybe GDP would be a good indicator because it's valuing the things that we have changed as what is important to us. Do you know what I mean? Like if I value today a sustainable company at $10, but tomorrow because I value sustainability more, it becomes $100 or $1,000. And then things that are less sustainable are less valuable. Wouldn't that in and of itself correct things?
Now you're getting into this whole area of trying to put market values onto everything, which is really quite contentious. And this has come up a lot in recent years because it's basically been accepted that we have to do everything within this neoliberal framework. And therefore, if you want to save, for example, biodiversity, then you have to put a price on it. And so, for example, there's all of these schemes now, for example, in Australia, where if you want to develop a project in a certain area that's going to destroy a wetland or so forth, then you go and find an equivalent, quote unquote, area that you can protect in order to offset that development. And you have the same thing in carbon. So you can, decide that instead of doing something here, we're going to go protect a forest somewhere else, and that carbon is equivalent. And start commodifying everything and putting a value on everything. There's all these economists that work on trying to figure out how much people actually value something like a wetland by asking them questions about how much would you pay in order to protect this piece. I really have a problem with all of that kind of stuff because number one, I don't see how you can put a value on things that have, in my view, they have intrinsic value. So species have a right to exist whether or not people think that they're valuable or not. And I think that it's highly likely in that kind of scheme that you're going to mainly value the things that people are most interested in, like charismatic megafauna, the pandas and so forth. And you're not going to value things that might have some incredibly important role, but people don't quite recognize that. And there's the whole area now of ecosystem services. Again, this is like, what does this ecosystem do to benefit humanity? I think that the ecosystem has a value beyond that. So I don't like the idea of putting a monetary value on everything. I think that that's the wrong approach. I think it's this framework that we're so embedded in that everything has to be about money. And I think that we really need to move away from that if we want to get to a legitimately sustainable society.
Well, and it's hard to escape from, too.
It is.
Public policy is almost completely dominated by that framework, as is government. So if you want to get something done, you want to propose a policy, like you said, you have to put numbers to it. Yeah. Not just as an offset, but you have to say what the social costs are as well as the actual costs. And all of those are in dollar amounts. Yeah. They're put on a spreadsheet. So I can say, well, I guess I won't destroy these wetlands because the cost of doing so outweighs the benefit, but only by a few dollars. So if this wetland over here, well, this will be worth it. And then, of course, we're missing what you just said, which is intrinsic value, or things that are, to put a word on it, priceless. Yeah. And this is an interesting, I don't mean to go too far down the philosophical tangent, but this goes back to the ideas of utilitarianism and the classic trolley problem, right? Like if I'm on a trolley or a train and I'm steering this train and I'm coming up to an intersection and there's 4 people on one track and 1 person on the other, but I'm headed towards the one that's going to kill the 4 people. Do I pull the lever to change it to kill just the 1 person? Or better yet, what if it's a child and then 4 elderly people who do I value more? And all of a sudden I'm asked to put a value on people. And it's easy then, once I've done that, to make that value a number value. And governments and public policy scholars are trying to do this. What is the value of a human being? And I think someone did it a few years ago, and they said it was like $8 million or something. So therefore, I mean, Apple or Amazon could probably kill a lot of people and justify it.
This is a total random tangent, but do you know that with automated cars, because of the insurance around them, they're actually having to decide how these cars are going to determine exactly that situation. Yeah. Which car are you going to plow into? The one with the elderly person or the one with the child? Yeah.
Which is interesting because it forces us to ask, what are the values that are intrinsic to us? How do we program those values in something else? Because the car is not just going to assume the things that we will assume from each other, having grown up in our society.
But also value varies across culture, right? And this is a country that is very diverse and has very important indigenous cultures that have very different ways of viewing nature and viewing human life. And so whose values are we going to take into account in policy? Are we going to say that it's just sort of the dominant Western values that we're going to adopt, or are we going to think about what nature has in terms of spiritual and religious and all those types of connections that other cultures have with nature? So I think I totally get what you're saying, that this is the way. It's so hard to get out of because it's the way it is. And even working within, a university where you expect things are sort of supposed to be progressive, you are constantly demanded to put a value on your research. You're supposed to be able to say, I can tick these boxes and I have these metrics and my, the number of people that cited me is X and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that accurately reflects the value of the work that gets done in a university. So I'm not saying that I have an answer for how we break out of this system. I'm just saying that we should actively be trying to push back against it because it hasn't always been this way.
Right.
It doesn't have to keep being this way.
And be cognizant of the framework, which is something that Noam Chomsky, for example, has said throughout his career, is like, recognize the framework with which you're working in.
Yeah.
You're making assumptions simply by looking at a spreadsheet, for example, that aren't necessarily in the spreadsheet, but that you're bringing with it and that the spreadsheet doesn't have to say.
Yeah.
And those assumptions are about the framework that we're all living with. And by recognizing it doesn't mean we have to overthrow it, but allows us to step outside of it when we need to.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really fascinating discussion, especially about universities. When I have conversations with many academics, one thing that they often bring up after the conversation or before on a separate subject is what it's like to work in a university these days, what it means to be a professor, what it means to be a member of the academy. And there's a struggle now because universities are having to sell themselves as valuable, value-creating, value-adding institutions that not only deserve your money to go become a student or for a parent to send their student there, but also deserve more funding from donors, deserve more funding from government because they're at the forefront of research.
Yeah.
Well, what does it mean to be at the forefront of research? Does it mean to change the paradigm within which we all live, or does it mean to produce 1,000 new papers this year
that nobody might ever read?
Yeah. And that may be just chipping away at the edges of knowledge, which is important, and no one's saying that it's not. But if we're trying again which is so interesting, to value, well, what does it mean to be a good or prosperous or important university that deserves money?
Yeah.
Well, it means to be curious. And how do you value that?
Yeah.
And I think you're very right, but it also makes it hard for politicians, for voters to make decisions when it's not easily digested, when it's so nuanced.
Yes, and I get that, but and this always drives me nuts about economics in general, is that, like you said, there are assumptions behind everything, but because economics makes things, economists like to just spit out a number, it makes things seem very simple, and people don't recognize all the assumptions that are behind what they're doing. And I was really hopeful that after the financial crisis that was going to be what changed, because the economists didn't predict that it was going to happen, and that it did. And the whole system sort of collapsed, and everyone was saying, okay, now we have to rethink things. The neoliberalism is dead, blah, blah, blah. And then that conversation just stopped and everything went back to the way it was before. And it's still the case where people seem to think that if an economist says something, then they must know what they're talking about and it must be true. And people aren't willing to question that area. And there's, I don't know if you've ever read anything by Ha-Joon Chang. He's a wonderful economist from Cambridge. And he's said many wonderful things. But the thing I love most about him is that he writes very digestible books for people to just understand economics. He tries to break open the discipline for other people, which is great for people like me. I'm not an economist. But one of the things he says is that he doesn't understand why people are so unwilling to have opinions about economics. He says, people were opposed to the Iraq War, even though they weren't international relations scholars. So why can't they, engage more with big economic questions? And he said partially the problem is because economists say, oh, well, we know what we're talking about. We're too smart. You wouldn't understand. And I think if we had more people like him that were sort of, trying to communicate that these are issues that you should care about, and just because there's a lot of numbers being thrown around doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of politics and ideology behind those numbers.
It's really interesting, the evolution of economics as a practice and how it's become so dominant in our world today. I saw a series of graphs not long ago that was essentially representing, I think it was on Twitter or something, and it was representing how often public figures cite academics in order to push their agenda, in order to get votes or to sell a particular announcement. And, it was a line graph, so it was showing, okay, so back in the 1960s and 70s, anthropologists and social scientists were cited more than anybody else, right? And then below that was historians and so forth. And in each of these graphs, and it was like cited by public figures, cited by politicians, whatever, the one line that didn't go up or down but only went straight up was economists. And now, so in the 1960s and 70s, economists were on there, but they weren't at the top.
Right.
They were higher to the top of the announcements that had to do with economic issues like monetary policy. And today, economists are the number one most referenced body of academics for almost any issue you can think of. And therefore, all the other lines of the graph, because it's a zero-sum game, are going down.
Yeah.
And this is really interesting to me, because how did economics become so powerful? And now, of course, we're living in a world where economics is entirely in doubt, because so much has happened in the last few years that frustrates economic predictions, or that can't be predicted, or economists don't have an explanation for. Anyways,
that sounds like a great graph. I need to get that.
Yeah, I'm sure I saved it. I could send it to you, but it's or I can post it on the website or whatever. But it's a really interesting sort of visualization of how academics have changed, but moreover how our understanding of and reference to the academy has changed.
One thing that Kyla mentioned earlier that I found really interesting is the fact that our ecosystem, our environment, has intrinsic value, that we can't just put a price tag on it and decide what to do with it or if we should destroy it based on how much money we'll make by doing so. And this theme of intrinsic value continues in this conversation. Coming up, we talk about the intrinsic value of democracy, or the intrinsic value of constantly creating and churning out jobs, and the point at which that becomes a little bit ridiculous. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On.
But I wanted to go to Keynes,
and
I want to talk about him for a second, and of course Green Keynesianism, which is what you do and what you are studying. And Keynes said something I think that is really important for what we're talking about, and he said that it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. And I think why that's important is because he's saying, essentially, and he was an economist who was not afraid of nuance and complexity, and saying this is a difficult issue. He took the middle ground. He wasn't certainly a communist or a socialist who said just overthrow everything and start over, but nor was he like Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, who said just let it go. Let everything go. He was trying to find a middle ground, a balance between the two. But he was nuanced, and I think what he was saying was, in part, remember that it's the framework and the idea that we're bringing to something that is dangerous or that is positive, not just the interests that we've calculated as bouncing off of each other. But can you talk a little bit about why Keynes is important, what the main principle is, and what Green Keynesianism is.
Yeah, so he had another quote, which I'm going to see if I can pull out, that also had to do with ideas. All right, so the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. So I like that one because I think the ideas about a Green New Deal and Green Keynesianism are not really that difficult. It's escaping from this framework of neoliberalism and escaping from the whole lessons, I think, of the global financial crisis was that neoliberalism was much more resilient than we had expected it. So all the predictions about its death were a bit premature. So I think I'm excited right now because it does seem to be like there is an opportunity for new ideas. So I don't know if you talked a bit earlier about the Democrats and what was going on in the sort of left and the ideas of green growth. But what's going on with the Democrats in the U.S. right now is quite fascinating because you've got sort of a bit more of a socialist wing. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is really quite an exciting figure for me. And she's proposed, based on a group that's sort of been working with her, the Sunrise Group, a Green New Deal. Now that's exciting for me because that's what I've been working on, but I get a little bit concerned because what does it mean in the end? What does green mean? And back in 2008, 2009, I got really excited that this was really a great opportunity for change and getting away from some of the old ideas and really getting away from this market focus of everything. Like we need to put a price on nature. We need to do all of that stuff. And it was really more about let's get the state back. Let's get the government back involved in like the sense of a welfare state that we used to have, but making it not just a welfare state, making it also an eco state. Is what I called it. So. And it just didn't really happen the last time around. So I am always cautious about it when I hear it coming up again. But there does seem to be a lot of momentum at the moment. So what I'm keen to find out more is, and to get out there is what is green, what should be in a Green New Deal, what is green. And I think that's where a lot of the issues about special interests do come back in, and where they are a problem. So I think people are going to be arguing from all different sides what can be green. So in the last crisis, you get the oil and gas sector arguing that carbon capture and storage is green, and that should be given a lot of money. And it was given a lot of money in the last round. Unfortunately, it basically served as a way to delay the transition because you could say, oh, we can keep pulling this stuff out of the ground. It's fine. We got this new technology. New technology, actually, it's always existed. It's existed for a long time. It's just scaling it up to that level is way too expensive to actually have it be a viable option.
Would you say that this is the rub of what you're getting at with Green Keynesianism is taking the opportunity out of the crisis? You know, the old Churchill quote that I think in your book you actually mentioned that Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's chief of staff, paraphrased when he said, never let a good opportunity go to waste. Yeah. Right? Never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Opportunity. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that tying that to Keynes in a way of saying, look, you have to balance out the peaks and the troughs, which is the classic view of what Keynesianism is. Yeah. But what are we talking about here? Is that really the issue here? Is that when there's crisis, there is opportunity. When there's a great recession, when there's environmental collapse essentially on the horizon, that creates an opportunity for growth, for innovation, for human collaboration. Is this what we're talking about, or is there another point of focus that we should be looking at?
Well, I originally wanted to call the book A Waste of a Good Crisis. The publisher didn't think that was clear enough what I was talking about. But I think that actually there is quite a bit of research that suggests that crises are not the best time to to actually try to get change to happen.
Well, Naomi Klein with her book, The Shock Doctrine, talks
yeah,
about
so
that.
so with the shock doctrine, you get the wrong kind of change introduced, right? Like people take advantage of the situation. It's the wrong people taking advantage. But other people have also just suggested that in times of crises, people actually are quite rigid. They stick to what they know because they're scared. And so policymakers are unlikely to actually move outside of their comfort zone. So when you're talking about stimulus funding, you're going to go for the things that you know work, and you're going to go for the things, the shovel-ready stuff, right? It's things that are straight off the shelf. We're talking building roads, building stadiums, maybe doing some, waste management updating, and municipalities always have these sort of lists of projects that they want to deal with. Probably not going to be talking about really blue sky thinking type of stuff. So that's one problem. So even though I saw that the crisis as an opportunity, because all of a sudden governments for the first time were willing to spend huge amounts of money when before it was, just not on the books. Governments were sort of pulling back and the market deals with everything. We don't need to wait for the next financial crisis to start thinking about a Green New Deal. Which is why I think it's good that this time around people are discussing it before a crisis has actually hit. I mean, we've got the separate whole ongoing environmental crisis, but in terms of financial crises, we don't need to wait for one to occur. There are plenty of opportunities for the government to step in, and I think it's somewhat more acceptable now in this period than it was prior to the financial crisis for governments to actually intervene a bit more in the economy. There's still a lot of pushback, but I think just the conversation just in very recent times has really shifted a lot. People are talking more about taxes, which is fantastic. I don't know if you saw on the Davos meeting that there was this Dutch historian who basically got out there and said, you've had 1,500 private jets fly into this meeting to listen to David Attenborough talk about climate change, and you're all here talking about justice and equality and blah, 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 but none of you pay your taxes. Like, you're just a bunch of greedy billionaires who don't want to pay your taxes. And Ocasio-Cortez in the States has talked about a 70% marginal tax rate above $10 million. So there are people that are actually starting to seriously talk about changing the way that things are done, having the government intervene a bit more.
Well, and our ideas, our institutions, the sort of the founding constitution of our society, whether written or unwritten, seem to be in flux at the moment. We're asking democracy, for example. People are actually, in a growing number, questioning whether democracy is a good idea.
But Trump does that to people.
They absolutely do, and that's part of the argument of why someone like Vladimir Putin would have wanted Trump to be elected, to make this whole system of government questionable.
Yeah.
I mean, the greatest victory of having Trump elected for authoritarians around the world is so that they can say, whether it's Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia, to say, oh, really? Is that what you want?
Yeah.
You want something like this? Because that's what American-style democracy will give you. But on the other side, there's other things that are in question, too. Whether it's just capitalism per se, but all of the things that come with it. Maybe it's even the framework of value that we were talking about earlier. We seem to be living in this kind of plasma of flux, and we're trying to understand what new ideas we should grapple onto in order to move forward, which is a dangerous time, but it's also quite exciting.
Yes.
And I want to bring Keynes back into it because in his book, A General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, he talks about, really, for him, the main issue with everything is short-sightedness. It seems to me that Keynes's thing was always to say, look further ahead.
Yeah.
If you're always just looking for the biggest bang for your buck in the current quarter of the business cycle or the best profit this year, you're going to miss the gains and the pitfalls in 3 years' time or in 7 years' time, because the cycles of human progress are much longer than anyone is able to see around them, right? I mean, it's impossible for human beings to understand not only the rational implications of something, but the emotional implications of something. I can't emotionally predict how I'm going to feel about something in 30 years, and therefore, I'm not going to make the right decisions now to bring about the best result in 30 years, but I will order a pizza, which is going to feel great. So, I guess what I'm asking is how do we overcome short-sightedness so that in this current state of flux, which is interesting because we're in flux, but at the same time we're rigid because things are dangerous.
Yeah.
when it comes to ideas. How do we make sure that we see the long game, whether it's for climate change, environmental sustainability, or simply democratic renewal? How do we ensure that we're seeing the long game in the current flux that we seem to be living in?
I think that's a really great point that you've brought up about short-sightedness, and I think it makes it very clear why it would be great to have Keynes around to talk about the environmental crisis, because that's all about short-sightedness as well. If we're not thinking in the long term, anything that we can do to prevent environmental problems is much cheaper, not just better for us, but cheaper than trying to deal with it once it actually happens. So it is the short-sightedness that it's a huge problem, because all of this stuff is sort of, it feels very immediate to me right now, because Australia, where I've been living for the past 10 years, Tasmania is currently on fire. They've had 40 plus degree temperatures, so it feels like climate change is already here. But much of the problem is that it's coming in the future, and we have to address it now, even though we're not directly dealing with it. How do we overcome that? This the $1 million question, and I don't have the answer. I think part of it is that I think that people can think about the future more than institutions can. So I think, and I'm really just blabbing off the top of my head right now, I think that I can think more about the future because I can look at my 2 daughters and I worry about them. And that makes me very concerned about everything that I do that affects them right now, but also what's going to affect them in the future. I don't think corporations operate in that way. They're worried about each quarter delivering returns to their shareholders. I don't think governments think that way because they're worried about their election cycle. So I think if we really want to change the institutions to make them more responsive to long-term issues, then it's a really big foundational question of how they're designed in the first place. Some people have suggested on the corporate side that we need to change actually the legal structure of corporations so that they are not just because right now they are really designed so that they have to return a profit to the shareholders.
And obligated.
That's an obligation, right? So if you can change that fundamental aspect and make them obligated to actually consider wider interests of the environment, the public, and so forth, perhaps that translates up into longer term thinking. With governments, election cycles, I haven't figured that particular nut out, but I do think that it is a structural problem. I don't think that individual people are inherently unable to think about long-term consequences.
So here's a philosophical question, just reincorporating what we were talking about earlier. Can we have an organization, whether it's government or corporate, that is a bunch of people, not just 2 or 3, but a bunch of people pursue an aim that doesn't have an identifiable, measurable value to it? So we were talking earlier about intrinsic values. Can a corporation pursue an objective and be obligated to something that is ill-defined or that is ephemeral? In other words, that doesn't have a number stuck to it. Is it possible, because what you said earlier is that people are the ones who can see the future. Organizations are amoral and blind because they're not people. Even if they have the rights of an individual, they're not individuals. But can an organization do that? Is that, I guess my question is philosophically, is that even possible for an organization to do?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be completely vague. It can be something as simple as, what doctors are required to do. First, do no harm. So when you're, depending on what, sector you're in or what type of product you're producing or whatever, as a corporation, that would obviously vary quite a bit. Be hard to say do no harm if you're a mining company. But there are B Corps that have sort of a different kind of approach, and I haven't studied them, but they do exist, and they don't operate entirely for profit motive. I don't know how they define what they do, but these types of experiments have happened. So.
Well, the federal government in Canada has created a category for social enterprises that do pursue a profit, so they're not non-profits, but they also pursue some kind of social objective. Many of them are obviously environmental groups, which can make money off of what they're doing. But it's a difficult question, because once you go beyond an individual person, it's like we were talking about earlier with the car. How do you program an autonomous vehicle to make ethical decisions. Well, it's not going to just make them because we've given it a spirit. It has to make them based on programming. In the same way, how do we program an organization or a government, whether it's written into the Constitution, to follow rules that are difficult even for human beings to follow? And it's not I'm not trying to trip us up here and get us down this weird philosophical rabbit hole, but I'm just asking, is it possible without using the current framework of numbers and value to do?
I think so. I think that it has occurred in other parts of history before numbers and value became so dominant. I think courts interpret the responsibilities of individuals and corporations all the time based on things other than numbers and value. So that type of, I think it's possible.
Like subjective judgment.
Yeah. I make subjective judgments all the time on whether or not my students have written good essays or not. So, these are things that people are asked to do on a daily basis. So,
yeah, it's a fascinating question, and it's going back to this tension between people and the organizations of which they're a part. And of course, I guess another question for you would be, in order to look further into the future, in order to prepare for a better future for all of us, again, environmental sustainability or ensuring democracy or whatever we're talking about, do we need to further enfranchise the individual, the person who is acting on behalf of their family, their loved ones, and who has a vested interest in these intrinsic values? Do you think that the answer is greater democratization and more individual power?
Again, very, very difficult question. There is a whole branch of the environmental field that focuses very specifically on that question of democracy. And there's an interesting study that was done recently, and I don't have the authors to hand, but it was basically it argued that it basically looked at societies that were more democratic. And again, they put values on what more democratic means, so everybody ends up using metrics in the end. They compared the environmental outcomes of countries that were more democratic versus those that had a stronger welfare state. And the ones that had the stronger welfare state actually did better in environmental terms. So maybe more democracy is the answer. I certainly don't like the current situation after living in Australia for 10 years, where you actually can vote and feel like your vote always counts because they have both a proportional representative Senate, but also a preferential system. So if you, for example, vote Green, you never feel like you're going to get the right-wing person elected because your vote's just going to mean nothing. So I definitely think that there are improvements that can be made to democracy, and there's lots of interesting work that's been done about more direct engagement in democracy and not just a casting a ballot. The problem, I think, is that with all these issues, they're so complex, and there is so much information that people have to absorb in order to make good decisions when they go to vote. And there's so much misinformation these days. And, the fact that people are excited because now in the United States, I think something like 65 or 70% of people actually accept now that climate change is actually happening and it's human induced. And that still seems incredibly low to me. Like it should be 100%. So, I have that intrinsic sort of desire for democracy to be the answer, but I'm not always convinced that we will get the best outcomes just by polling the people.
Well, and we've seen the problems of democracy since the inception of democracy. It's as Winston Churchill, to quote him again, said that it's the worst form of government except for all the others, right?
Exactly,
And I think he was actually paraphrasing Aristotle when he said that, which is when Aristotle talked about why democracy is good and why it's bad. And he essentially said that, look, it's the best when it works, but it's the worst when it doesn't.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult question, and I often bring a lot of these conversations back to democracy, because it's this strange word that has different meanings for different people. Again, it's one of these ideas that Keynes talks about, and it's also ill-defined.
Yeah.
Because what many people think of as democracy is actually liberal democracy, is actually constrained democracy. The founding fathers of the United States very much intended to prevent mob rule and direct democracy. They saw that as anathema to the project of American progress. And that's built into our system today. And yet, it's true. If the problem is that we have these organizations that are unable to be anything other than short-sighted, whether it's a 4-year election cycle or a quarterly return, how do we reclaim the long-term view that's interested, as Keynes was, in his grandchildren?
Yeah.
And I think that it's a very difficult question that has to be brought back to what is democracy? Why is it important? Do we need, quote unquote, more of it?
And the problem of scale too, right? Because democracy can often work quite well at a very small scale, at a local level, but then you have these global problems that need to be addressed some way at a global level, and then you have a huge democratic deficit at that level, and you can see things like happening in Brexit in Europe, where people don't feel like they were, properly able to participate in. I don't have a good answer for any of this.
But you did. You gave a lot of good answers. I got one more question for you. And it's, I know that you're, because I saw it on your website, you're always looking for more master's and PhD students.
Yeah.
If you had a one or a bunch of them in the room right now and you were going to task them with a question or a path to go on to explore Green Keynesianism, what would be the biggest ones you'd want to give them? What would be the biggest pieces of meat for them to chew on to get to the bottom of these issues? Like, what are the big departure points?
I think at a basic level, there's a question that I don't know if it'll ever be definitively determined, is what is green? Where are we going to draw the lines around what we actually want to invest in and what we don't want to invest in, and how do we make those determinations? And when I think of green, I'm not just thinking of what are the emissions, what are the environmental impacts. I see this as being a very social program as well. So how are we going to make sure that Green Keynesianism delivers on things like inequality? How are we going to make sure we get a just transition for people that are negatively affected by losing their jobs in the fossil fuel sectors? I think the whole idea that environmentalists don't care about people is something we need to get away from. So I think that issue of what should we actually invest in is pretty core. And I think the other question goes back to what we were talking about with growth, is just getting back to this idea of what more fundamental shifts can we make so that we are not just talking about investing in sectors that will create economic growth. We're talking about some more radical transformation where people will be employed, but they'll be employed in more meaningful ways. So these will be good jobs, not just green jobs. These will be not necessarily the sort of jobs that mean that you have to work a full time, more job sharing, more shorter working week issues. Just how do we get away from that entire growth paradigm without necessarily tackling it head on? Sort of how do we sneak it in there by getting at things that people would actually agree with, kind of social changes that will make people happier, as well as maybe doing something about the consumption issue, rather than just shaming people about consumption. Because there are, we haven't gone into this, but there are so many aspects of consumption that are really difficult for people to deal with on an individual basis. There's, all the marketing that gets sent at you. And if you have kids, you know about the nag factor for buying stuff. And, there's a whole industry designed to make you want to buy stuff. So you shouldn't, be ashamed that you've been susceptible to that. How do we move away from all of that to a different paradigm?
And I just have one more question just because of something you said. A lot of what we talked about here is about creating jobs, creating labor, not only because it gives people something to do, but it also balances the economy. It provides the thing that we all agree is an important thing. It's every politician in every election since the dawn of time wants to create jobs. It's a very clear issue that can be addressed. But to what extent should we be creating meaningful employment? And I just have an anecdote about this before you answer the question. I was living in London, and I remember having lunch with people. And in England, it's just less common for people to clean up after themselves in a restaurant. I don't know if you noticed this when you lived in England, but when I am in A&W or in any restaurant, I take it upon myself to put stuff in the garbage and throw it away. And it's just something that I do, whether it's as a Canadian or whatever. But British people, they see it. Well, that's not my job. The server staff will do that, right? Someone will come up and clean this for me. We were in a public festival hall in central London, and I started cleaning up my stuff, and they looked at me like I had three heads. Like, why are you cleaning up your stuff? Someone will clean that up. And I said, well, that's not nice. Let's clean our own stuff up. What are we, pigs? And they said to me, well, it creates jobs. And I remember being flabbergasted because I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So why don't I just blow up a building? Because that'll create jobs. Why don't I just, and I hate to be crude, urinate on the street because someone else is going to have to mop it up and that'll create employment. It sounds deeply self-defeating and stupid and I hate to be getting so passionate about it, but that if the only thing that's important is creating jobs, then there's many ways to do that. We can just blow stuff up. We can create crises because jobs are created out of crises. To what extent are we talking here about creating meaningful employment or creating jobs that give people satisfaction at the end of the day, and they're not just cleaning up my pee off the middle of the street?
I think that's an excellent point, and that's exactly what I want Green Keynesianism to mean. I don't want it to mean that people just get any old job. I want them to be meaningful, preferably unionized jobs, good employment. And I have to respond with an anecdote because you reminded me of something that I find just hilarious and depressing at the same time. So I worked for Greenpeace for a while in Australia, and one of the main campaigns that we're working on was trying to prevent oil exploration from occurring in a place called the Great Australian Bight, which if you look at a map of Australia, it's basically that big sort of carved out bit at the bottom. It's an amazing area. There's actually like a cold southern reef there they keep finding new species all the time. It's a whale migration area and a nursery for whales. So just, amazing place. And so, of course, oil companies want to explore there. But there's been a whole succession of companies that have gone through and actually have dropped out. And one of them was BP. And when they were trying to, sell the project to the local communities, one of the things that they actually said was, if there's an oil spill, that will create jobs because the local community will have to come in and clean it up. So, yeah. And that's what I don't like about GDP, right? That gets counted as being, an economic boom. And thankfully the people in the area weren't really sold on this because they're focused on tourism and fishing. Really important. That was really what was important to them economically. And obviously those things would be very negatively affected by an oil spill. But you see that mentality that people would actually think that this is a selling point for a project is that if there's an oil spill, that creates jobs. I
mean, the military-industrial complex, which looks forward to warfare, which wants conflict to happen so that they can sell more missiles and bullets and bombs. And I think just to round us out, this is actually really interesting because these anecdotes are actually telling us something about Green Keynesianism and the problem with infinite growth and overconsumption. If we're so obsessed with creating new opportunities and growth and growing our economy and building new buildings, then we are going to blow up old buildings just for the sake of it. Yeah. We are going to destroy heritage and we are going to make our habitat completely unsustainable because our only interest is in growth. And eventually we're going to get to a point where we're going to have to decide between, everything we have and just continuing on a very dark path where we are eliminated because we can't even live here on this planet anymore. Hopefully we have somewhere else to go.
And that was some of the critique of, the original New Deal was that, you're digging holes and filling them in again. And that we just need to create jobs. It doesn't matter what we're doing. And I thought, Green Keynesianism is the opportunity to say, no, actually, we should really be careful about what we are investing in, and it should be more than just creating jobs. We should have additional benefits.
And what is the value of not digging a hole?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Kyla, this has been a really tremendous conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Really enjoyed talking to you.
To learn more about Kyla Tienhaara, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as all episodes going forward, and ways to get in touch with me on social media or by email with your suggestions for episodes, or of course for your feedback on this episode or any other one. Now, your quote of the week is from Ha-Joon Chang, the economist that Kyla mentioned earlier in our conversation. Here goes. When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Special thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein. Next week's episode will be with Terry O'Reilly, not the hockey player, but the host of CBC's Under the Influence and the author of This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence. I'll see you then.